The lines in the Jai Shankar's statement and its implications. India's Foreign Minister, Jai Shankar, recently made waves with his comments about Africa. Speaking at the Japan-India-Africa Business Forum, he emphasized India's commitment to capacity building on the continent. He highlighted skills development and technology transfer as key pillars of India's approach. This all sounds great, right? Well, here's the catch. Jai Shankar contrasted India's approach with what he called extractive models of engagement. This was widely seen as a thinly veiled jab at China. The implication was clear. India is here to help, while China is here to exploit. This narrative, however, deserves closer scrutiny. It's not as black and white as some would like to paint it. The truth is, both India and China are vying for influence in Africa. Both see the continent as strategically important, both want to tap into its vast potential. But their approaches, while different, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And framing this as a simple case of good versus evil is not only simplistic but also unhelpful. The capacity building claim. A closer look at India's engagement in Africa. India's focus on capacity building in Africa is commendable. Initiatives like the India-Africa Forum Summit and the Pan-African E-Network project have made a difference. These programs provide training, education, and technological support. They empower African nations and foster sustainable development. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. India's investment in Africa, while significant, pales in comparison to China's. We're talking about $12 billion from India versus over $200 billion from China in recent decades. That's a massive difference. So, while India's heart might be in the right place, its wallet tells a different story. This raises questions about the scale and sustainability of India's commitment. Furthermore, critics argue that even India's capacity-building efforts are not without their flaws. They point to instances where Indian companies have been accused of exploitative labor practices in Africa. Others highlight the fact that much of India's aid is tied to contracts with Indian companies, raising concerns about a lack of transparency and potential conflicts of interest. The specter of debt trap diplomacy, examining China's role in Africa. Now let's talk about China. The debt trap diplomacy narrative has gained traction in recent years. This narrative suggests that China is intentionally lending money to African nations, knowing they can't repay. The goal, according to this theory, is to leverage these debts for political and economic concessions. This narrative, while tempting, is not entirely accurate. Yes, China is a major creditor to African nations. And yes, some countries are struggling to repay their loans. But the situation is far more complex than simply China preying on vulnerable nations. For starters, the claim that China is solely responsible for Africa's debt burden is simply untrue. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has debunked this myth. Their data shows that China holds only a fraction of Africa's total external debt. The majority is actually owed to Western institutions and private lenders. Section 4. Beyond the rhetoric, unpacking the realities of Chinese investment. It's crucial to acknowledge the positive impact of Chinese investment in Africa. China has played a pivotal role in building critical infrastructure across the continent. We're talking roads, railways, ports, and power plants. These projects have boosted connectivity, facilitated trade, and improved living standards for millions. Of course, not all Chinese investments are created equal. There have been legitimate concerns about transparency, environmental impact, and the displacement of local labor. These concerns need to be addressed, but to dismiss China's contributions entirely based on these issues would be disingenuous. The reality is that China's engagement in Africa is multifaceted. It's a mix of the good, the bad, and the complex. Painting it with a single brushstroke, whether positive or negative, does a disservice to the nuances of the situation. Section 5. A tale of two narratives, contrasting media portrayals of India and China in Africa. It's fascinating to observe how the media portrays India's and China's engagement in Africa. The Indian media tends to highlight the softer aspects of India's approach: capacity building, technology transfer, shared values. China, on the other hand, is often portrayed as the bogeyman, the debt-trapping dragon. This contrasting portrayal reveals a double standard. When India invests, it's seen as altruistic. When China invests, it's viewed with suspicion. This biased narrative ignores the fact that both countries are pursuing their national interests. The reality, as always, is more complicated. Both India and China have their strengths and weaknesses. both have the potential to contribute positively to Africa's development. And both, frankly, have made mistakes. Section 6. The need for nuance, moving beyond binary comparisons in Africa. The constant comparisons between India and China in Africa are tiresome and unproductive. It's not a zero-sum game. Africa is not a prize to be won or lost. It's a continent of 54 diverse nations, each with its own unique needs and aspirations. Instead of pitting India and China against each other, we should be encouraging collaboration. Imagine the possibilities if these two Asian giants pooled their resources and expertise. Think of the infrastructure projects they could undertake, the skills they could impart, the economic opportunities they could create. It's time to move beyond simplistic binaries and embrace a more nuanced understanding of the situation. Africa needs partners, not saviors or exploiters. Section 7. A call for collaboration towards a more inclusive and prosperous Africa. The future of Africa should be determined by Africans themselves. But that doesn't mean others can't play a constructive role. India and China, with their resources and expertise, have a responsibility to engage with Africa in a mutually beneficial manner. This means moving beyond the rhetoric of rivalry and embracing a spirit of cooperation. It means listening to the needs of African nations and working together to find solutions. It means investing responsibly, transparently, and sustainably. Ultimately, a prosperous and stable Africa is in everyone's interest. It's time for India and China to recognize this shared goal and work together to make it a reality. The potential for positive change is immense if we can move beyond competition and embrace collaboration.